Hello, everyone. How are you? Happy Friday. We are back. I am Kelly O'Neill. I'm the director of the Imperia Project at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies, and this is Degrees, Minutes, Seconds. This is the time on Fridays where we try to attempt to deliver to you a quick and engaging story that encourages you to go out there and take up space. Think about ways to integrate maps and thinking about location and the relationships between yourself, your own world, and the world of the past, as you can find it expressed in maps. So the thing I wanted to tell you about today is that I have been spending time with an atlas, with a set of maps. An atlas is nothing more than a set of maps. And this is a really particularly interesting atlas. It was made by a man who was essentially Greek. He was a subject of the Russian Empire, but his parents had come from Greece, emigrated to the Greek islands, and emigrated to the Russian Empire in the late 18th century. He was born in Crimea in a town called Yevpatoria, and his name was Yegor Manganari. He was educated in Nikolaev, and now Mykolaiv, part of Ukraine, southern Ukraine, and kind of swallowed up in the world of the Navy, the Russian Navy, naval science, and cartography. And he remained in that world for his entire life. And one of the most, the highlights of his life was publishing the Atlas of the Black Sea. So the atlas was published in 1841, and it was actually published by the Black Sea Admiralty in Mykolaiv, right on the coast of the Black Sea. It's called the Atlas of the Black Sea, but it's not really about the sea. It's really about the places where water meets land, intersections between maritime world and the terrestrial world. So it is obsessed with coasts and harbors and inlets. Even with the sea floor, this atlas contains incredible details about soundings, so water depths, but also the nature of the seabed. So if you want to know where the sea floor is composed of crushed shells versus silt and sand, Manganari tells you this. He includes that level of detail about the world of the Black Sea, and particularly its coasts. And really, when you stop to think about it, what this atlas does across its series of nautical charts is it describes the Black Sea from the perspective of a ship captain, which makes all kinds of sense, the perspective of a mariner. In fact, this was a navigational tool. It's not a decorative map. It's a navigational tool that was used by the Russian Navy, in fact, until the end of the 19th century. It's a navigational tool. It is meant to facilitate the movement from one port to another, from one harbor to another, and it is definitely meant to enable mariners to avoid danger. Now, Manganari knew all about danger. He spent 5 or 6 years actually sailing on a frigate through the coast of the Black Sea, from the north to the east to the south to the west, surveying, taking soundings, taking measurements. He had an artist on board with him making beautiful renderings of the view from the ship to a harbor so that ship captains could consult these harbor perspectives and know whether they were in the right place. He spent years doing this, and those happened to be years when the Russian Empire was attempting to conquer much of the Caucasus. So war was raging. There are armed, warships sailing across the Black Sea throughout the 1820s. Russia goes to war with the Ottoman Empire. It's a volatile time, a dangerous time to be in the Black Sea conducting, essentially measurements and soundings. So Manganari knew danger. He was involved in battles and skirmishes, but those are not the dangers that he builds into his map. Instead, Manganari's atlas tells us all about the treacheries of the natural world, right? Manganari and his sheets is obsessed with currents and winds and shoals and sandbars. And one of the things that becomes very obvious is that he is obsessed with the mouths of rivers. The ultimate source of danger in the Black Sea ends up being the mouths of rivers. Let me just give you a quick sense here of the intricacies of this map, the meticulous detail, right? You can see here a map of right around just north of Odessa, right around Kherson, close to where the Dnipro River comes out into the Black Sea. All of the shallow and depth soundings that Manganari took. Let me just bring up one other map so I can show you. Here we go. Manganari, I have become convinced that he associated danger in the Black Sea, not with what's going on in the Caucasus, but with the mouths of rivers. And this is really important because the Black Sea is the drainage for a handful of some of the most important and longest rivers of Europe, including the Dnipro or Dnieper, but also the Danube and the Dniester and the Southern Bug. There are all kinds of European rivers that are flowing hundreds and thousands of miles southward to drain into the Black Sea. And I think when we look at a map and we see rivers draining into a sea, I think that our assumption is that there's nothing more natural than the connection forged by a river to a sea, right? Get on that river anywhere you want, up in its upper reaches, and you can just flow down and eventually hit the sea. One of the things that you realize when you look at maps from the 18th and early 19th century is that nothing about the relationship between rivers and seas should be taken for granted. Traveling along as a river course might be relatively easy for a water molecule or maybe a fish. It isn't always easy for a ship, especially a ship big enough to transfer loads of grain or oak trees, oak timbers, down to the shipyards where navies were being built. There's nothing that could be taken for granted about the relationship between rivers and the seas. Manganari knew this, and his atlas focuses in. The sheet that you're looking at on the screen describes the area of the mouth of the Dnipro River. So this is close to the city of Kherson. And if you look, you can see that there's an awful lot of shading on the screen. Wherever you see white, that's essentially, in the lower part of the screen, that's water. But wherever you see shading, those are low-lying areas, marshlands, wetlands. There's an awful lot of reeds. And what I have come to understand by looking at this maritime world through the eyes of Manganari is that ultimately, from his perspective, there was nothing more dangerous from the perspective of a ship captain than reeds and low-lying areas. And as I was thinking about this, as I was thinking about his obsession with sandbars and shoals and marshlands, there was something about it that kind of is jogging my memory. And I thought about it for a little bit, and I realized that Manganari was trying to tell me, one of the great lessons of empire building. His, obsession with marshes is really one of the most important things that we need to know about empires in the 18th and 19th century, and that is this. If you want to connect your grain fields or your oak forests, your productive spaces of the interior, to the great global markets, and you connect them through the port cities that lay at the mouths of rivers, right? If you want to do that, if you want to become a global player, commercially, militarily, there's one thing that you need above all else. And it's not a map, it's not a surveyor, it's a whitewater rafter. Yes, I mean it when I say that. It's a whitewater rafter. I'm not making this up. There's actually archival documents that serve as evidence for what might seem like an incredibly crazy claim. The thing is that as the Russian Empire took possession of these major rivers that flow into the Black Sea in the late 18th century and early 19th century, they set themselves the task of building a navy for the Black Sea. And if you want to build a navy, you need to build ships. And if you want to build ships of the line, you need oak timber, ship-grade oak. So one of the highest priority tasks for the Russian imperial government, as in the years after Catherine the Great died and she's succeeded by Paul I and then by Alexander I, is to find great oak trees, oak groves, and connect them to the shipyards of the south, where they're going to build a navy that will enable them to exert their power throughout the Black Sea, take over, displace the Ottoman power in the Black Sea, move into the Mediterranean, and who knows, what the end of the story could be. But they can't do any of that if they can't build ships, and they can't build ships if they can't bring oak trees to the shipyards. And so rivers become incredibly important because it's relatively easy when you don't have railroads or really good roads to take your oak trees, fell them in the fall, wait for the spring thaw, lash them together, and float them downriver from the forest land down to the shipyards, right? And what could be more simple? What could be more natural? And the Dnipro River, was one of the great thoroughfares for this activity. But there were problems with the Dnipro. There always had been, and essentially there always would be. The Dnipro is a great river, but it is riddled with rapids. And the imperial government became aware of this very quickly, and they began to experiment with making the river navigable, trying to develop a system of sluices and canals that would enable ships to navigate the river from its source to its mouth. And they made great claims that, sure, they had pulled it off and it really wasn't that hard. But it quickly, by 1810, became clear that this maneuver was pretty ill-fated, and the Russian Navy was going to have to find a different way to deal with the Dnipro. Rapids weren't the only problem. The treacherous sandbars, the archives are filled with complaints about sandbars and shoals. And this was really a problem between the cities of Kiev and Kremenchuk. The art of sailing down the Dnipro involved finding local branches of the river that were deep enough to allow ships to travel. And the fun thing was that these routes changed from year to year with the spring floods. So the changing nature of the river wasn't unique to Dnipro. Rivers in the north did the same thing. But in the north, there were lots of pilots, local pilots who lived there, and would wait until the floods went down, and then go out every year and measure and mark the distances and the depths of the freshly carved channels. But there was no one to do that in the south. It was very sparsely inhabited. That meant there were very few river pilots and fewer overseers for this process. So that was a pretty significant deterrent. And as if it weren't enough, there were also massive quantities of silt that were deposited at the mouth of the Dnipro. So there were places near Kherson, where everyone wanted to build ships, where the water was only 6 feet deep, and that is nowhere near deep enough to enable a ship of the line to make its way to the sea. So these connections between rivers and seas, they weren't there to be discovered, they had to be created, they had to be forged. And that's where whitewater rafters came into the story. There were rumors circulating in the 1790s of crazy Polish landowners who had slapped together rafts of various kinds and made their way, not down the Dnipro, but down the Dniester River, just a bit further west. And by 1803, there was a particularly compelling tale being circulated among members of the Russian government, and they made their way all the way to the Ministry of the Interior. And the local military governor got wind of this. There was apparently this low-ranking official who worked in a criminal court in Podulia, and his name was Ludwig Mierzejewski. And Ludwig is the whitewater rafter par excellence. He sailed down the Dniester River, which is itself about 800 or more miles long. He built himself a boat on his estate, way upriver, and made his way 600 miles downriver over the course of 8 days. And he made his way to the mouth of the Dniester River and then traveled by road to Odessa and reported his adventure to an engineer who was working for the local government and was a rising star in the Department of Water Communications. And this relationship that gets crafted between this Polish landowner who recreates himself as a river rafter and completed the first known descent of the Dniester River, becomes the relationship that enables the Russian government to completely rethink its economic and hydrographic plan for the Black Sea. Merzheyevsky was really, really enthusiastic about his experience and his success. He made his way all the way back to his home province and to his estate, and he built 2 more ships, and he filled them with goods that he produced on his estate, including 50 ship-grade oak trees, right? And he set out along the Dniester River again in 1804, intent on proving that the Black Sea fleet and the future of naval power could be provisioned with ship-grade timber found along the Dniester River and provided by the local nobility, more cheaply than could be done any other way. So Merzheyevsky, of course, has strong personal commercial interests, right? In his mind, a navigable Dniester River meant that he could bring his goods down, and in return, other landowners in places, for example, like Crimea, where they're producing large amounts of salt, which is also essential to the economies of the region. So Crimean salt could make its way back up the Dniester River, producing this wonderful symbiotic relationship that's linking the Podolian forest lands in the north to the Crimean Peninsula on the Black Sea. And people start talking about this and getting really excited about it and putting together these grand schemes and describing how, and I'll quote one of their documents, the whole commerce of Volhynia, Kiev, and Podolia, which is currently sent upriver to Prussia, could be reoriented to the Black Sea, right? There's almost no end to this ambition, all launched by the successful rafting adventure of Ludwig Merzheyevsky. Now, actually making the Dniester navigable would require feats of engineering and organization. There were dangerous fords to contend with. There were underwater rocks. There were rapids, of course, near Yampol. And there were really perilously shallow depths in the lower reaches of the river. And if I can bring up one last image to show you. Let's see if I can find it. Yes. So here you see the upper part of the mouth of the Dniester River. And on the right, you'll see there are kind of 2 lines that are making their way from the lower part of the image up. The one on the right is formerly the course of the main channel of the Dniester River. And you can follow it until it gets lost in the reeds, right? It completely disappears. This major river that will pick up on the other side of the reeds, like gets lost in the reeds. So it was really this part, the shallow depth of the Dniester River that posed, this is the treacherous area, right, poses the greatest challenge. There were all kinds of other challenges. There were landowners who had built their own mills along the river, which narrowed the river so that merchant ships couldn't get by, right? The river became so narrow that the ships couldn't get by. So this poses all kinds of problems. But within a year of Merzheyevsky's triumph, Tsar Alexander I approves the establishment of a towpath and the opening of shipping along the Dniester River. So this becomes a priority of the imperial government. And by 1805, 100 boats of various sizes had sailed along the Dniester, and local agents of the Department of Water Communication, right, the kind of that little organ of government that was so excited about the prospect of these hydrographic vistas being opened up by our Polish whitewater rafters, were busy building wharves and stationing pilots along the river, developing the infrastructure to make the Dniester navigable. The mills remained a problem, and worst of all was the ultimate treachery of nature. The fact that the spring floods changed the course every single year, such that one year you'd have a really thick growth of young trees right along the river, and the next year they'd be gone and they'd be submerged below river water. So peasants never knew, they never knew if they had to bring peasants on the ships wielding axes to cut down trees or not. Navigable stretches overnight could turn treacherous. Stubborn patches of tree growth could disappear in the course of 1 week, below the surface of the water, saving untold hours of axe wielding. All of these things are kind of embedded stories on the pages of this atlas of the Black Sea. The map alone, as any good map will, can prompt all kinds of interesting stories, hypotheses, and insights into the relationship between the natural world and the world of the human-made environment. The maps don't contain all the answers, but they prompt us to go to the archives to find the stories and bring them back to the maps so that we get a fuller and richer understanding of the spatial history of an empire. So that's what I wanted to share with you today. So if you come back next week, which I think you should, we're going to dive into the history of Snake Island. Has all kinds of historical names, but you'll know it as Snake Island. Played a very famous role in the early stages of Russia's war against Ukraine. So we'll get into that and find out what's so important about a singular island in the Black Sea with a history that goes back to the Greeks. See you next week.